Hello, U.S. history students. So today we are going to talk about Chapter 24, Section 1. It says Part 2, domestic, or it could be foreign affairs. So this is President Nixon outside of Vietnam, okay? And so when Nixon becomes president in 1968, he runs on the domestic policies of law and order and more conservative issues, meaning more rights to the states, allowing states to make many of their own decisions. So let's see the new conservatism of Nixon. What does new federalism mean? It simply means transfer federal power to state and local governments. It means less decisions in Washington, D.C., and more decisions in the state capital of Sacramento or in the city of Los Angeles. Okay. Revenue sharing. Okay. It says that when the federal government distributes the money to the states, again, local governments, cities, or counties, they are having more decisions in what to do with the money. Okay. So we also have the issue of welfare, right? Well, Nixon wants to overhaul the addition of or overhaul welfare, right? Welfare meaning payments by the federal government to low income families. So he comes up with this idea called the Family Assistance Plan, where the money that is earned by families, low earning income families, is tied to job training and that they must accept employment. However, it is unsuccessful. He has disagreements with the left, who say that it is not enough money for people or enough incentive for them to get back to work, and the right side saying that people are already receiving too much federal funding. Okay, they're already getting too much money from the government. Okay, well, Nixon had quite a mixed record. Okay, on federal programs. Okay, some programs he strengthened and some he weakened. So, for example, he increased Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Okay, so Social Security is the money that you put into when you work all your working years, 25 to 62 or so. And then when you retire, you get some money every month. Okay, and there's a formula for that. Medicare, Medicaid. So you have discounts on medical benefits for people that are elderly, over 60, or people that are low income. He also created the Environmental Protection Agency as well, right? The group that's responsible for protecting the environment, right? The skies, the air, the water, and so on. So he signed it into action. Okay, and then he also created the Occupation Safety and Health Administration, which basically is a federal program which protects workers, make sure that they have a safe working environment. So Nixon has this very polarized record because in some ways he is taking away money from those who need it the most, and in other ways, in other areas, he's granting them or protecting those rights. Okay, and he also created the EPA and OSHA, right? And many of these are issues today that the Republicans do not want to fund very much. Okay. But he did weaken some federal programs. He eliminated job training programs called the Job Corps. And he also had this idea, which later the Supreme Court said was illegal, which is impoundment, which is withhold funds. So in one way, he said, in revenue sharing, I'm going to allow states and local governments to do what they want with the money. But when he wasn't pleased what they were doing with the money, he impounded it, which means that he held it. Right? And when you impound, like, for example, people get their cars impounded if they don't pay tickets and then have to pay to get it out. Well, he held it back from states, and basically the Supreme Court said you can't do it. That Congress had already passed the laws, and the money belonged to the states. Okay. So one of the other major issues with President Nixon, of course, outside of Vietnam here, right? He was a law and order candidate. Basically, he was tired of criminals taking advantage of the system. Okay. He was also tired of all these riots and rebellions in the streets. Okay. So what are some examples of how Nixon intended to bring law and order And why were they considered controversial? Just about everything Nixon does is considered controversial, right? Nixon actually spoke out many times about the silent majority. It means the larger population of the United States was silent. Yes, you see all these people in the streets, in front of Washington, D.C., at college campuses throughout the country protesting, but they actually only make up a very small percentage of the American public. Most of the American public, right, the majority of them are in favor of tougher laws, in favor of more enforcement of the laws, okay? Also in favor of the Vietnam War, but they are silent. They don't get any publicity. They don't get any mention in the press simply because they are going about their everyday lives, going to school, going to work, paying their taxes, and abiding by the laws, okay? So Nixon, we know, is quite paranoid. He is also narcissistic, which means that everything is a focus on himself, and he's also paranoid, believing that everyone wants to bring him down. He has a lot of what we call chip on their shoulders, okay? Meaning all these issues that he's had growing up and through several years, okay? So illegally wiretapping people, right? Basically checking out their phones and trying to listen to what they say. And it goes back for everyone from Democratic rivals to Martin Luther King, to Malcolm X, any other group who he thought was un-American or unpatriotic, right? And basically wiretapping them without a permission from a judge, without a warrant, okay? He used the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, basically the tax guys, to monitor civil rights groups. So he said, I'm going to take the IRS, which is basically only monitoring tax funds, right? And I'm going to use them as a spying network to see what these civil rights groups are doing, and maybe if we can bust them or get them in trouble, right? Indict them for tax issues. Okay. He literally had an enemies list. He had a list, a physical list, right, within his office, right, of any individuals, groups, and or organizations which he considered an enemy. And who knows how many hundreds, if not more, people were on this list. Okay. He also used his vice president, who later is going to have to resign because he accepted bribes, basically, right, to attack the press and to attack the protesters. So you think now when some of the politicians are attacking the press, never heard this before, well, then obviously you weren't around during the Nixon era, right? So Spiro Agnew basically kept on insisting that the press was the liberal media and was always on the side of the liberals and not the conservatives, and really did not represent accuracy, did not represent the views of the majority of the people, right? The silent majority. He also attacked protesters. He attacked basically the hippies, the people for, the type of people that went to Woodstock as well, okay? Or people that avoided the draft. And he basically said, grow up, get a haircut, and get a job and become responsible, okay? Southern strategy. Well, as we know, many Democrats in the South were quite conservative, okay? And Nixon was looking to get those people to turn from a Democrat to a Republican, okay? And we see that nowadays, right, where largely the South is dominated by the Republican Party. And Nixon says, I'm going to get them. Why? Because most of the Southern Democrats, right, are against integration or against the civil rights movement. And Nixon is going to find a way to bring them into the Republican Party, okay, by appealing to their unhappiness with federal desegregation policies and the liberal Supreme Court, right? Miranda writes, Griswold, right, that the criminals have too many rights. If the law doesn't do everything exactly perfectly, then all of a sudden these criminals will be let out and loose upon the safety of the community, okay? And so what happens is in 1968, remember you have Governor Wallace of Alabama, he basically creates his own party, and he's able to take some of the Democratic votes from him. So Nixon says, I'm going to get all those Democrats that voted for Wallace because of the issues of desegregation and a liberal Supreme Court. How do I attract them? Well, I'm going to take this middle course regarding integration. I'm basically going to say, well, we can integrate, but it's up to the local cities. It's up to the southern states. I'm not going to push them to integrate. Okay. So the Supreme Court actually ordered, okay, Nixon to abide by Brown versus Board of Education, right? Saying that you need to desegregate the schools. Okay. So Nixon is now supposed to enforce the laws. Okay. He also opposed extension of the voting rights of 1965, right? Which basically allows the federal government to come in and make sure the southern states protect the voting rights, mainly of African Americans. And he opposed that extension. However, it was extended by Congress. Okay. Busing, right? So there's a Supreme Court case in 1971, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. Okay. And what happened was basically many of these schools simply said, oh, we are not ready to integrate. Okay. And so schools that wanted to integrate bused kids. They put black kids, white kids on buses and sent them to the same schools to make sure that they had integrated schools. Okay. However, Nixon knew that many southern cities, many southern states were not doing this, and he was okay with it. Okay. And the Supreme Court said that school districts may do it in order to desegregate. Okay. It was actually allowed. And even in the late 1970s, Los Angeles actually did this as well. Bus kids in public schools, sent them to schools away from their neighborhood in order to have various different ethnic groups go to school, go to the same school. Okay. Nixon opposed this busing. Okay, whether he did this, whether he believed it or not, we don't know. But basically what Nixon would do was speak out against it. The Supreme Court would go against him, and he would hopefully get the Southern Democrats on his side. Okay, growth, inflation, and unemployment. All right, well, Nixon faces a unusual economic situation in that he's facing growing inflation, okay, and growing unemployment. So if you look at these years here, right over here, right, the growth of the United States, right, basically GDP, growth domestic product, okay, is falling tremendously, yet we have high unemployment and high inflation. Well, what is he going to do about it, right? So stagflation is a fairly new term that comes to use in the 70s, right? High inflation and high unemployment, because they usually don't go together. It means that more people are out of work, yet prices are still very high, okay? So the economy is stagnant. It simply doesn't grow, okay? Well, why? What are some reasons? Well, we have an increase in spending due to the Great Society program and Vietnam. And we know, studying from 1968, right, that those two will not work together. That the more money that's put into Vietnam, the less money that's put into the urban needs, right, and even some of the rural needs, right, of the Great Society. So a large amount of increased spending. We're trying to fight a war and then also bring up the economic situation of people in dire circumstances as well. Okay, there is definitely increased international competition. For the first time, the United States, right, has to go against countries such as Germany, countries such as South Korea, countries such as Japan. There is a very competitive international network. Okay, now oil. The United States and all the Western countries are extremely dependent on oil. Okay. And so what we see here is there's a dependency on oil, and there's a cartel created in the Middle East. Okay. It's called the Organization of Oil Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's a cartel, which means it's a group of businesses that come together and basically determine how much oil they will produce. They get to decide the price because they are controlling the supply, and the demand is still always there. Okay. So how does Nixon respond? Well, he attempts to raise taxes. Obviously, people aren't happy with that, and that is definitely not a normal Republican idea. Okay. He says, I'm going to cut the budget. But it's tough to do that when some money's already been funded for the Great Society, and also the continuation of the war in Vietnam. He wants to raise interest rates, right? the rate that you have to pay on interest when you borrow money or get a loan. Okay. However, Congress basically refused many of his ideas. Okay. And through the early or mid 70s to the late 70s, Jimmy Carter, the next president, elected in 1976, is going to have to deal with the same issues, and he does not do well either. Okay. So the economic issues continue. Okay. And that is all we have for today. The next video will be extremely short, just a few slides on Nixon's foreign policy, again, outside of Vietnam. Talk to you later. Bye.